Recording in progress. Remember to set the recording. That's always the important part. But welcome you to the third installment of our Orange County African American Historical Society's series of programs virtually celebrating Juneteenth. We have organized a session of panel discussions. If you've missed the past two, they are available online at ocahs.org. And you can watch our first one that was about Juneteenth overall. Our last week's was really, was titled Putting the Home in Homecoming. And this week, of course, is the stories of homecoming. This theme for our celebration throughout the month is Juneteenth, the homecoming celebration. And that really comes out of our in-person celebration, which will be held this weekend on Sunday, June 19th. In downtown Orange. We will be celebrating the opening of a commemorative park in an African-American business and residential area in downtown Orange that was largely taken out when in the mid-20th century when a road bypass was put through the area. And there'll be music and there will be performances and there'll be all sorts of things going on in downtown Orange on Sunday. So we hope you can all join us in person. Our lecture series or our conversation series really will be continuing on throughout the month all the way through July 6th. So every Wednesday, I hope to see you all here. And some of you I've seen so far every week. So that's been really exciting. But I want to go ahead and get started with our program. And I'm really excited about this program because not only are our presenters really amazing, they're fun people who are also, friends with each other. And so I think this is going to be a really great conversation and really bring out a lot of fun stories, particularly with the theme being about family stories and oral histories. So I'd like to introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is Naya Bates. Naya is a Ph.D. candidate in the Department of History and the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University. She studies 19th and 20th century US history, global environmentalism, and rural cultural landscapes. For the past 5 years, Naya has worked in public history, preserving rural African American community history in Central Virginia. In that time, she has also served as the Director of African American History and the Getting the Word African American Oral History Project at Monticello. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Guardian, CBS, on the Today Show, NBC, PBS NewsHour, ESPN, The Undefeated, and Black Perspectives. She's been a guest on several podcasts and streaming platforms, including Oprah's Book Club, Bonnie Dunn's American Gardens, NPR's All Things Considered, Sporkful, and Dan Pashman, and Following Harriet. She earned a BA in African American Studies and an MA in Architectural History with a certificate in Historic Preservation from the University of Virginia. And Naya was born and raised in Central Virginia and is a descendant of several enslaved families who were enslaved in this area. So needless to say, Naya is often on a speaking circuit much larger than this one. So we're really excited to have her here. Our next panelist is Justin Reid. He is the Director of Community Initiatives for Virginia Humanities. He helps lead Virginia's statewide engagement, partnership building, and General Assembly of African American Cultural Resources Task Force. He previously worked at the Morton Museum and National Historic Landmark in his hometown of Farmville, Virginia, where his family were litigants in the US Supreme Court decision outlawing local, quote, massive resistance to school desegregation. In 2013, he oversaw the opening of Morton's national award-winning $6 million permanent exhibition of the civil rights era student activism. He's the co-founder of William and Mary's Lemon Project on Race, Public History, and Memory, and a board member for the Center for Nonprofit Excellence and the Virginia Tourism Corporation. And our last panelist is Hannah Scruggs, and she's a Genealogy Reference Assistant at the Robert F. Smith Explore Your Family History Center at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. She's a Central Virginia native, and she graduated with a master's in public history from North Carolina State University and a bachelor's in history from William and Mary. and her research and professional interest include slavery, descendant communities, and African American environmental history. And Hannah will be starting at Harvard University in the fall. So we've got some big heavy hitters here on our panel. So I wanted to start today, and we're going to have time for questions from the audience towards the end. So feel free to comment in the chat or put questions in the chat as you think of them, and we can incorporate them in towards the end. But I want to start a little bit asking the panel about the theme this week. So the theme of our homecoming celebration, of our Juneteenth celebration, is homecoming. So just sort of starting as, what does homecoming mean to you all? And specifically, since you all are Central Virginians, what is it about homecoming here in Central Virginia, and what does it mean to you here in Central Virginia? And I'm going to start with Justin. Put you on the spot, sir.
I was hoping I wouldn't have to start. You know what? I take great pride in being the oldest panelist here, but I feel like I'm always learning from Hannah and Naya. So I am also getting a Princeton and Harvard education. So I hope they send me something in the mail. What does homecoming mean to me? Right? That's the question. Oh, wow. I mean, I guess to begin it means a lot of things. But when I hear the word homecoming, I think, a lot of my friends will probably think about like football games and high school and college and all those things. But homecoming for me is a church celebration, and it was the thing that I looked forward to most as a kid. Like, this was, at least in my family, it was bigger. It was bigger than Christmas, bigger than Thanksgiving. I mean, as a kid, homecoming was my favorite holiday, because it's when all of my extended family will return, to the home place. I was the country cousin. I was the one that was part of those relatives who stayed in the rural South. But every homecoming, my aunts and my first cousins from Philly or New Jersey or wherever people had migrated to would come down to Virginia, and we would just spend just like several days catching up, connecting with family. My grandmother hosted a big dinner after church every homecoming Sunday that had hundreds of people. That's not exaggeration. We put up these large tents. So, when I hear the word homecoming, it immediately makes me think back to my childhood growing up in rural Central Virginia, and how much, those family celebrations and that tradition meant to me as a kid.
Thank you. All right, Naya, you want to jump in?
Sure. I think my story is very similar to Justin's. I mean, when I think of my family, I think of my father being one of 16 children and my mother being one of a lot of kids, right? And we were kind of the part of the family that stayed. And so one of the things I remember most about my childhood is the family gatherings we would have every summer, whether they were tied to, our church homecomings or whether they were just family reunions. And so for me, homecoming used to have this idea of like permanence. I always felt it was special that my family had places to return to. A lot of families can't actually say that. And so I'm just thankful that we've been privileged both on my mom's side of the family and my dad's side of the family to have places to come. I mean, my mom's side of the family, and I talk about her side a lot less, and that's the side that's connected to Orange County. But my grandmother was a teacher. And so we would have our family gatherings, and all the community would join too. And so, for me, homecoming is a mix of creating space for our family, but also space for the community to gather.
Thank you. All right, Hannah, you're on.
Yeah, I think similarly to Justin and Naya, my family is also part of the branch that stayed. And it's interesting to think about homecoming because I've always felt very connected to the place where I grew up, and still feel very connected. I don't live there anymore, but I still feel so connected to that place. And I've always felt very grateful to have that sort of visceral connection to Central Virginia. And also thinking about, I think I've thought more lately about what it's meant to be part of the generation, or that the line, I guess I should say, that stayed. And my dad's the youngest sibling of his family, his also large family. So even hearing stories about my older cousins who are like 10, 15 years older than I am, coming south for the summer, coming to the grandparents' house, or coming to, stay with my dad, and he was one of the only ones left at home during that time, and thinking about, how, well, it was only like a 10-minute drive or a 20-minute drive to get to my grandparents' house when I was growing up, and how that is different even in, in a generation of people.
Absolutely.
And
So
have you beat Hannah? I just want to say I was 2 miles from my.
Oh, okay.
I grew up 2 miles from my grandparents' house.
One of the things that when you all and I were talking previously, and Naya and Hannah, you both mentioned, is being part of the branch that stayed. And I can't remember who said it when we were having this side conversation, but that so many oral histories about African-American history in the US focus on the people that leave. So I just wanted to know if any of you wanted to speak a little bit about the importance of oral histories for those branches of families that stayed, and for telling the history of places like Central Virginia where there are people that stayed.
I can start this time. Yeah, I think a lot of people, I work in genealogy, and I work with people doing genealogy and family history research. And something that's been really striking to me lately is the differences in the people that I'm working with who have families who are connected to either their parents grew up in the same place, or their families grew up in the same places where they've been since slavery or emancipation for multiple generations throughout the South, and working with people who are from elsewhere. I actually worked with 2 different people yesterday, and this was kind of the story of both of them. Like one family had migrated multiple times, and one had stayed. And just thinking about how rooted in place some of the oral histories are for the people that stayed, and how much of an awareness of a place that people have when you're doing research, or you're trying to find out more about your family history, because you do know the names of the roads, or you do know where something is located, whether that's the plantation site or the land that your family used to own, as opposed to folks who do have the histories of migration, where they may know the names of the counties and may have heard the names of the towns, but it's a little bit more abstract. And so when you mix the oral history that you have from your family with a knowledge of the place, and the intimate knowledge of the place, you have a fuller picture of what of the family history. You have a fuller picture of the life that your family led, in generations prior. And I think when we work with people who do live outside of where their families are originally from or connected to, we always encourage people to go back, understanding the places and the counties, not just we encourage it for research purposes, because a lot of things are at the courthouse or at a local historical society, but we also encourage it so people can actually see the place and have an understanding of the landscape and the location where their ancestors would have lived.
And I'll just add there, just speaking of the importance of place in oral history, I feel like most of the oral history that I've inherited, well, I'll first say, I've been fortunate to be able to do the more formal interviews with some of the oldest members of my family, but I think a lot of the stories that I'll carry down to the next generation come from, rides around town, being stuck in the car. And I guess as a kid, it feels like you're stuck in the car and driving forever. But it was just recently, like a month ago, my uncle, my mom's oldest brother, who recently passed away. I mean, he was in his 90s. And I remember, my mom's the youngest than I. And I remember, I don't know, something just really inspired me to go and just start driving around, because I was trying to kind of retrace, the steps that he would often take me as a kid. So it's really remarkable how, the built-in natural environment triggers certain memories, right? and you're able to absorb those stories, because as you're around your elders and other members of your family, different places will provoke a certain memory, and it'll just be casually shared. And I think those are some of the most important stories as well.
Absolutely.
Right. And I'll just add, in the work that I was doing at Monticello with the Getting Word Project, one of the things I noticed in recording formal interviews with a lot of the descendants is that the descendants who remained local and didn't migrate, right? The character of their oral histories had a lot of detail about certain traditions that had been passed down, right? They had more recipes. They remembered childhood houses and could describe the layout of those spaces, what it was like for them to walk around in grandma's house, right? What it was like for them to play in the yard. They could describe those communities. And the descendants who migrated out of those same families, you see a lot of the same kind of like similar patterns of speaking about their family history. They'd say, we're very proud of our family's history of cooking, even if they didn't have the recipes, right? Even if they didn't have the same level of detail. So what I would say is that I think it taught me a lot about just the nature of families, like what happens to families when part of the family migrates, whether they stay connected, how they maintain those histories and those traditions, and what oral history gets passed around even within the same generation, let alone what is passed down through multiple generations. And so I think, Justin and Hannah both pointed at this idea of geography. So, just thinking about the ways that historically Black communities were organized around families, and then recreating families as also recreating the physical spaces that they inhabited. Is definitely one of the things that I've learned in doing the work at Monticello.
Absolutely. And as an archaeologist, the connection to place is hugely important. And another plug for people to listen to last week's program, which was all about the power of place. There's a lot of amazing overlap here. But one of the things I would ask if you all wouldn't mind doing is for sort of the layperson, for the non-professional, what really is an oral history and why is it important? Why isn't it just in a book? So go ahead, Hannah.
Yeah, oral histories are the stories that are passed down throughout families. Today I was listening to a podcast and it's a podcast about gossip, and someone was saying that oral histories and family stories are also an important form of like passing down those things and passing down the things that don't always get recorded. Sometimes passing down, juicy stories, and also sometimes passing down the day-to-day of what your family was doing. Oral histories they're very broad. They encompass a lot of things. They range from being formal interviews that you sit down and do and record, to being conversations where people just start sharing information about your family's past. I'll let Justin and I also jump in.
Yeah, I would just add to that for me, I think of all history as oral history. I think there's a tendency to think that oral history, stories that are passed down verbally, are somehow less reliable or less true, less authentic, perhaps, than history you read in a book. But who's to say that, Louisa Minor writing in her diary in 1930 or 1830 is writing down the truth, right? She could be writing down her own version of the history. And historians tend to look at written documents and say, well, this is how it happened. And, all history has that degree of subjectivity or interpretation, right? And so I think for me, oral history is, you could think of any history as oral, right? Like literacy is a marker of privilege and access, not necessarily the veracity of a version of events that happened in the past.
Absolutely.
Exactly. And obviously, documentary evidence, physical evidence is important, but I think a lot of us will agree that oral history really is more valuable. And when I say it's more valuable, for something to be passed down through oral tradition, you are making a conscious decision, or it's sometimes unconscious decision. Actually, probably more often than not, it's unconscious, right? But there's a decision is being made. That story, that memory, whatever it is, carries a certain value, and because of that, kind of inherent unconscious sometimes value, it is being actively transmitted. to the next generation. And so, there are certain ancestors in my family who I know very little about from oral history, but I realize now that the ones I do know a lot about is because they had such a profound impact, right, on the lives of those around them, that those stories and their life's achievements and works were handed down. And so my grandmother, who was raised by her grandfather, he was born enslaved, and I feel very close to him because my grandmother took so much pride in her grandfather. He was a minister in town, and I very distinctly remember just how she talked about him and the different stories she told about having to she would get dropped off at the bridge that connected the county to the town, and then she from the bridge she would walk to her grandfather's house so she could be able to go to school in the town, and she would stay with me. These types of stories, and he had such a huge impact on her life, and so I feel like I know him better. And so oral history to me is something that really shows those things that have impacted us most, the things that we cherish, or the things that have had the greatest contributions. And by continuing these stories and sharing them with the next generation, that also shows how, I guess, how really, I don't know, I guess it's sustainable. Maybe that's not the best word, but to be able to share, transmit this oral knowledge across generations is a very special type of value that I think can't really be quantified, and you can't necessarily find in the physical documentary record.
Absolutely. Are there any stories in your family or experiences of talking to family members that led you to your career today? I mean, each one of you has talked about the importance of these family stories, and each one of you has dedicated your life to not only studying the past, but studying the past really of your own backyard. So is there any family stories or family experiences, or maybe family members that sort of pushed you in that direction?
I know Justin and Hannah are probably tired of me sharing this story, but it actually, my family history is why I'm a historian, right? So I grew up spending a lot of time with my dad's parents in Sismont in Albemarle County, Virginia, obviously right next door to Orange. And my grandmother was born in 1927, but my grandfather was born in 1908. So I feel like in my entire childhood, I just had these rich family histories. And they used to always talk about the plantations that were in Albemarle. So they would talk to me about Castle Hill. They would talk to me about Cloverfields. They would talk to me about Mary Mill, right? So these were household names. And yet I was maybe a junior in college before it ever connected to me that the places that my grandparents worked in freedom were also the places where my family was enslaved. And I was taking a class my third year at UVA with Lewis Nelson and Maury McInnes. And the class was about art and culture of the slave South. And as part of the class, we were studying the material culture of slavery, looking at pottery and crafts produced by enslaved laborers. We were looking at quilts. We were looking at plantation landscapes, all of these things that went into this history of slavery. And as part of the class, we went on a class field trip, and Lewis Nelson had arranged for us to visit Cloverfields. Now, I wasn't even trying to go on the field trip. I thought, I already know this place. I grew up hearing all these stories. My grandmother hated it. She had a terrible experience there. The owner was a mean woman who my grandmother worked in housekeeping. So she would make the bed. And if the bed wasn't made tight enough, if you couldn't bounce a quarter, then the white woman who oversaw the work happening in the house would destroy the bed and make them do it again, right? So these are the memories that I associated with Cloverfields. So I didn't really want to go, but it was required. It was for a grade. It was for a class. So I got on the bus like everybody else. For them, it's a new landscape, but for me, it's literally in my backyard. My parents still live less than a mile from this plantation. So we get on the field trip and we get out there and we're walking around the plantation. We saw everything on the outdoor landscape first. So we saw the smoke houses, the dairies, the working spaces for enslaved people. We saw the overseer's house. And the very last place that we saw was the main house on the plantation, right? So the woman who was leading our group was actually a descendant of the original owners of the tour, and I mean of the property. And she took us into the basement. That's the first space we saw inside of the main house. And there was a collage of people who worked there on the wall. And so she starts describing this house and the people, and the whole time I'm staring at the collage because I started to recognize my entire family on that wall. There were pictures of my grandparents, my aunts, my uncles, people who went to my church that I knew well. And not very many of them had shared that oral history of being connected to Cloverfield. So I kind of interrupted the class, right? I'm like, this is my family. Why do you have these pictures? And everyone turned around and they just stared at me. And that was kind of the moment that I knew that I wanted to be a historian, that I wanted to be someone who recovered that history, that shared those narratives, that figured out why our local Black rural history has oftentimes been overlooked. And so it is this family work of searching my own backyard and my own street, my own neighborhood for histories that led me into what has been an excellent career, I think, so far. I'm excited to keep doing it.
Excellent. Hannah or Justin, do you want to add to that, or?
Sure, I can add to that. Again, Justin and I know I've heard the story a lot of times, but I grew up really interested in historical fiction. Like as a kid, that's all that I read. American Girl books, all of them, Dear American books, all of them, had them all, was like into them starting at like too young. That's like what my mom read to me. And she'll also say that like you from a very young age would try to like periodize where your grandparents fell into those books and like where they, you know, before I went to school. So I've always really liked history. But when I was in 4th grade, still reading these books, one of my teachers had like a side project for me to do for class, and she pulled me aside and said, I have these contacts. They sit in front of me at church. Their last name is Johnston. They own Bremo Plantation. And I thought that maybe you would want to go visit and like write a story and do like research. So it was like an introduction to research project. And when I said, okay, I was 10, and I went home and told my parents, and my dad was like, oh, like I grew up near there, and I think our ancestors may have been enslaved there. And I was like, okay, I understood what that meant, but not like, I was 10 still. So like I had an understanding, I had read all of these historical fiction books, and like I grew up in the rural South. My history education of the Civil War wasn't amazing in elementary school, or of slavery wasn't very strong, but my parents had made sure that I understood, you know, the impact of that past. But I think I'm still really grappling with what that means in a longer term way, and what it has meant to like kind of learn some of those things at such a young age and have such a tangible connection to them. But anyway, so we set up a time to go visit the Johnstons at Bremo, and I also wrote to my aunts. My dad's aunts lived in the area. Well, one of them lived kind of nearby, and the other I think lived in New Jersey at the time. But I wrote them a letter asking for information about this history and this family that lived here, and they sent me back pages and pages. You know, handwritten letters of family stories. So that was like, I met them very few times, but I did have these letters and this correspondence with them, which was also really special and ties into oral histories because I was a kid. But I went to Bremo and we walked around the property, and I went to this place where my ancestors were enslaved. And then I wrote a short story about it for a class, and then it was published in the local historical society newsletter. And I got, when I was on the tour, I learned some local history, some oral local history about the enslaved at Bremo and their literacy. And I got to touch the actual placards that were used to teach them how to read and write, which was still very powerful experience and kind of a formative memory for me. And as I got older, that happened in like 2000, one. And then I ended up interning at the local historical society when I graduated from high school. And then I started to get into more genealogy and trying to put these pieces together. Bremo is a very well documented plantation, and there's a lot of plantation books and things that are at UVA. And I worked with Andy Cumbo Floyd, who's a local historian and genealogist, whose mom was my piano teacher, that she grew up on the Bremo proper, and had done a lot of research on the enslaved. And as I got older, I ended up finding the names of my ancestors that I had been sent and this is like now I guess when I was in college, I started doing genealogy on Ancestry and started looking into the census records. And I've started to find the names of the people that my aunts mentioned to me in those records and in the census and in the plantation documentation, and starting to hear these things again. So I feel like it kind of built on itself. It started when I was really young, but then I've continued to find more information about these people that I've known about for my whole life, and like even up until extremely recently. So like recent months ago now. And that's definitely impacted what I've chosen to do. My first job out of grad school was at Montpelier, as many people know. And I found a really profound connection between knowing the fact that the man who enslaved some of my ancestors would have known and been a colleague and a friend of James Madison. And so that, the community, understanding the connection of the communities, and the landscapes and the people have also driven me further in the direction that I've been going in my career.
Thank you. Justin, do you want to add?
I had a question. Hannah, can you remind me how old you were when you published in the local historical society's newsletter? I
was 11. So yes, so a copy of it is saved in the Fluvanna Fluvanna time capsule that's in the courthouse.
5th grade, 4th grade.
I think I wrote it in 4th grade and it was published when I was in 5th grade.
Okay, okay.
Justin, you got muted.
Yeah, sorry. I was trying to remember what I was doing when I was 11, but I don't think I had established my public history career.
Your CV doesn't go back to when you were.
No, it doesn't go back to fourth grade. And I'll say that I think for me it was pretty gradual. I mean, as a kid, I was always interested in history. I remember the social studies SOLs were always the ones I never had to study for. It was just whatever, and I would get perfect scores. It felt like it required a lot of effort because I was just so naturally interested in history. I'll say some of the biggest kind of lay historian influence from my childhood. I mean, I mentioned my uncle Kendall, who again, he was my mom's oldest brother, and he was in his 90s when he passed away a couple of years ago. I don't remember how old he was. He was just in his 90s. You reach a certain point and you're just in that decade. He was in his 90s. He would always just kind of casually just share stories, and like I said before, take me around to different places in the county, as a kid. And I think the other biggest influence is my dad's mother, my grandma Reid. In Central Virginia, rural Black Virginia, we say grandma. I realize there's no D apparently in there. But my grandma Reid was the clerk for my church. My home church was founded in 1868. My grandmother had been clerk for almost 30 years before she, retired from that position. And she was just so attentive and kind of meticulous with her record keeping. This was in the 90s. My grandmother had a giant copy machine in her home. It was in hindsight pretty unique, but she was responsible for recording and documenting and preserving the church's history. And even in her home, which I spent a lot of time in, otherwise I would have been a 100% latchkey kid. I was surrounded by family photos. I mean, her home was floor to ceiling covered in photos, no exaggeration. You could not see an inch on the wall. There were so many family photos when you walked into her home. So I was constantly surrounded by that history. I think the maybe great awakening for me as far as public history, and my background is a little bit unique in that it has primarily focused on civil rights public history. That kind of awakening occurred, I forget which summer. I mean, it was a summer when I was, I guess, upperclassman at William & Mary, and I was taking a constitutional law class, and I was sitting there. I mean, it was a small, like, seminar style class, and we were watching a documentary on Brown versus Board of Education. A history that I do very little about, honestly. But the documentary talked about the civil rights movement in Brown, talked about Virginia's role in this history, and a lot of the documentary focused on Farmville, the town I grew up in. And I'm sitting there, and there were a lot of people that I recognize, like people that I grew up with, who were being interviewed. And again, my classmates were looking at me because they knew I was from Farmville. I don't like, this is news to me too. And I think in hindsight, there were some things that were shared with me as a kid that I probably just wasn't conscious enough to really hold on to. But I think that really piqued my interest, because I recognized that there was a really important history and story here that involved my family and my home community. And despite me growing up in that community, I didn't really know it. And I became really curious about just finding out as much as I possibly could and uncovering as much as I could, and ultimately discovered that my family was very intimately involved in civil rights organizing in Farmville. So I think that was my kind of eye-opening moment. And then maybe the second thing was having the chance to study abroad in South Africa, because I studied American studies. I was not intending to study American studies. I was international relations major, focused on foreign service for most of my college career. But when I studied abroad in South Africa, and here we were about, I guess, 20 years post-apartheid, and it was just so fascinating to me, I guess, the parallels between the histories in South Africa and the US. And this is also around the time where I was coming into greater consciousness of the civil rights history here in Virginia. And that was kind of the moment where I decided that I wanted to make the switch. I wanted to really focus more of my energy and attention around US civil rights history, and particularly the history right here in Central Virginia.
Absolutely. All
Can
of
I
you
just jump back? Oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Naya.
I was just going to jump back in and say, I think what's so special about oral history is that you never hear these stories just one time, and you never hear it exactly the same way either. So, like, none of us got here because we heard a story once and then we forgot about it for a long time, and then we thought about the story that we heard one time, right? Like, speaking for myself, my grandmother's favorite thing to do was to get up in the morning, take a walk, and then eat some ice cream. Right. And I love that, because my parents would not let me eat ice cream before dinner. So, when I stay with grandma, we get up, we have breakfast, and then we go for a walk, and she'd tell me the stories that she wanted to tell me. And then we would have ice cream, and then we would watch TV. And it was the same process every time I stayed, right? We'd get up, walk down the road. And one day she might tell me about the donkey named Biscuit Face. Another day she might tell me about the school, the Sismont School, which is a Tuskegee planned school funded by the Rosenwald Project. Or the next time she'd tell me about the church. And sometimes she might string those things together. It might be the church, the donkey, and then walking through the woods. Or it might be, oh, I had a fight here one time. So, like, oral history is like a layered experience. And it's something that you get more and more of over time, if you're blessed and privileged to have people to talk to who will share the same stories over and over. So, like, maybe when I was a kid, I didn't appreciate that. But certainly as an adult, now that I'm sharing these stories with other people in my family, I realize maybe she trained me or groomed me to be the person who received the oral history, because I realized that she told me stuff that my dad either didn't know or didn't pay attention to, right? So some details might miss a generation, but somebody picks them up along the way. So I just wanted to point that out, because I think that is, Justin was talking about the value of oral history earlier. I think that's what's so special about our experiences, is that they accumulate over time. It starts as like a small grain, and then you end up with a giant snowball at the end.
I think that's exactly right. And actually, now you set up beautifully for my next question, which is, if folks are getting these family stories, or they want to be accumulating them, what advice do you have for non-professionals about acquiring and preserving and continuing on the oral histories, the family stories that maybe they've learned or heard? how do they, what's your advice for getting it to that next generation, to getting it to those other family members? Go, Hannah.
Yeah, Hannah does this every day, I feel.
Yeah.
Explore your family history.
I think something that this is twofold. One is I really want to encourage people to share who have the oral histories in our older generations to share. I think for a long time and still there are histories that are hard to talk about and events that are hard to talk about that are not shared. And I think it's important to share those things. And so I think it's important to share the non-traumatic histories too, the joyful histories and like the mundane, like all of it. And I think trusting that someone is listening, whether it's, the oldest child in the family, or whether it's the youngest grandchild or the youngest great-grandchild, like someone is listening, and someone will want those stories later. I think sometimes people don't share. It has seemed to me that our elders sometimes don't share because of either the pain of those stories, or because they feel like people aren't necessarily listening to them. But I think sometimes, even when you don't expect people to be listening, then they are, someone is listening. And I think for those of us who are interested in the history, that when we want to know it from our elders, we don't feel like we've heard enough of the stories, that we want to hear more. Talking to our family members more, asking questions about just life. It doesn't have to be, again, like, what was this painful experience of history like for you? You can just, when you were growing up, like, what was your favorite thing that you learned in school? Like, what did you enjoy the most when you were a kid? What the thing, like, sharing those things are important too. I do encourage people for those more painful histories that I think it's important to have a record of, because if they're oral histories and then they die with the family members, then they don't get told and those things get lost and then they can be repeated. But I do encourage people to, if they can, to write them down if they don't want to talk about them, and put them somewhere to be opened later, or share them with someone, just so that it doesn't get lost. But I think just having conversations with those family members and starting to connect about those things, even just asking for names, the things that you need the most, that are most important for getting started with doing family history research, tend to be names, places, and years. Starting with some of those questions can be helpful and can be conversation starters. There are a lot of different resources about doing oral histories, but the main thing is to ask specific questions that can't just take a yes or no answer. Ask for details, and have follow-up questions for the questions that you have, and also ease into the conversation. If you're doing a more formal, or want to do like a formal and recorded interview, make sure you have the consent, and make sure that you're paying attention to the body language of the person that you're talking to. And if you see someone getting uncomfortable, or it's, getting agitated, you can say, that's okay, we don't have to talk about this, or maybe we'll come back to this later. But being, the person that you're talking to is a person, and things bring up memories, and sometimes seemingly unrelated things can bring up hard memories too. So I always want to make sure that people are aware of that too.
Excellent advice. Justin or Naya, anything to add? The professionals got it.
Yeah, it's hard to follow. It's hard to follow Hannah.
Hannah
really is the expert.
She is. I mean, I'll just add that, if the goal is to, document, an oral history, it's never been easier, right? I think don't get caught up, right, on having professional equipment.
You can
a
use
cell
your
phone.
phone.
Yeah, a cell phone, hit record and let it go. I think, my partner, her grandfather passed away when he was also in his 90s, and I was really adamant that they record him during one Thanksgiving. And like to this day, they're all forever grateful. Not only do you have the stories, but you can just hear his voice, right? And it's something that they were able to do with their phone. So I know there have been moments where I've been caught up in I mean, there are oral histories that I've lost because, one, because procrastination, right? But two, because I thought I had to do it a certain way, right? And in hindsight, I recognized that I had every tool I needed. So don't let, your inability to edit or, have lighting or whatever it is you think you need, because really everything you need is in your hand already.
Right. And I would just say, the gift of time is very precious. I think so often we get moving so quickly, we overthink what it takes to do the work. And so I wish that in my younger days, when there were more living elders in my community, that I had taken the time, to sit with them, even if it wasn't to record a formal oral history, like just to chat. It doesn't even have to be like a high pressure, intentional situation to record or to collect oral histories, right? It can be as simple as, chatting with Miss Bernice after church. It could be as easy as, hey, I stopped by, I have 5 minutes. I have some photos on my phone. Can you look at them? Can you identify people? I think that's another tip. Like if you have family photos and they're not labeled, please take the time to take a pencil out and label the ones that right? Someone 30 years from now will love you forever. That you took just a split second to label the photo. I also think for people who are, doing family history research and looking into their communities, I think the non-traditional sources tend to be the richest ones. So, if your home church is standing and you have the opportunity, go see if they have their original records. My church has records all the way back to 1896. It was founded in 1869, and we lost the first book of records, but still, there's a ton of information in there. Obituaries, family programs, family Bibles, stuff that you might have laying around the house that you think perhaps isn't important. I would say spend some time looking at those things as well, because you never know what you can find that will help recreate that oral story.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to point out something that Naya said, which was take out a pencil and write down the names on the back of the photo. That's really important. You don't want to use a pen on the back of our old photos. If you don't have a pencil, take a picture of the picture, write it on your phone, write it on another piece of paper, and then when you go home and have access to a pencil, write it with pencil.
Excellent. Yes, our archival training comes out here. I'd like to invite the audience, if they have any questions, to put them in the chat, or you can raise your virtual hand and I can unmute you. Already, we've got a question from a familiar friend, Dr. Matthew Reeves. Matt asks, he says, "Hi, Justin, Naya, and Hannah. So good to see you. This is amazing. Have any of you connected with a family member or with a family object, and how was that different?" Connected a family member to an object, Matt? Is that what you're asking? Let me just make sure I read that right.
A family member who had an object that has had some significance or meaning, right?
Sure, let's go with that.
That was my interpretation.
Yeah, I'm sorry, that's exactly what I meant. It was just like having a family object. And hi, everybody, it's so wonderful to see you guys. Love you all. If talking with a family member about a family object and how that was made for a different connection.
Tell the archaeologists always want to talk about things.
Yeah, and you know what? And I feel like because I had the privilege of growing up with 3 of my 4 grandparents, this is like a few miles from their home. I feel like I had all access to all the objects, right, in their home. I remember my grandma had a pedal sewing machine, and it's still there. I mean, it was a Singer, one of those wooden, with the metal, that she inherited from my great grandmother. And even in my own home, I have some what do you call them? The candles, not kerosene, maybe it's kerosene candles. The candles that are in the glass jar with the oil. Those 2 were inherited from my great grandmother. So now I'm the 4th generation to carry these items in my home. But I remember as a kid, like one of my favorite things, I almost thought it was a toy. but it was a tin cup that my mom gave me. And it was one of those extendable tin cups. Have y'all seen those? And it belonged to her mother. I guess my grandma Eva would she would put it in her purse. When she was out and about, she could pull out her tin cup and grab water, put it back in her purse. And like I still have that thing. And that's sustainable right there. You talk about waste, you walking around with this tin cup in your purse that you just pull out. I don't know, for some reason those are like the first few things that came to my mind.
My grandfather was a builder. He was a stonemason and he dug wells. So I feel like some of the objects I connected with most were actually the places we would drive past that he said, I built that, right? So I feel like now when I'm driving around, I'm like, he built that, he built that, he built that, I'm just pointing out the window at all the things. And so, yeah, I guess my thing is innately connected to space and place, but just interesting because I think it does evoke different memories.
Absolutely.
So this isn't an object that has to do with my Central Virginia family, but my mom's family much of them still live in Minnesota. And sort of the opposite of my dad's family, my mom's side of the family is the only one that left and everyone else is still in Minnesota. But when I was younger, I used to love to go through my grandmother's, she had her mother's and her mother's scrapbooks. And also like her jewelry, and like there were newspaper clippings. Like my grandmother was extremely into memory keeping. She had photo collages and scrapbooks and all of these things. And so I think thinking about that now as an adult and me doing family history and genealogy and feeling connected in that way with the scrapbooks. But also I have a necklace that I found among my grandmother's things that I found described that was my great grandmother's at her wedding. And I found the necklace, the piece of jewelry described in a newspaper article. And then like saw the necklace, and I have it now. It's mine now. But that's an object that's really special that I've connected with my family.
Excellent. I think that what's really neat about each of those objects is that they're inherently very personal. And even thinking about stonemasonry or building as being sort of a public thing, something can visually see it, but the actual hand connection to doing that work is so incredibly personal.
Yeah, Matt, thank you for that question, because now I'm going to be reflecting on it like all evening, looking around the house. Yeah, I never really thought much about the meaning of this material culture that we've inherited, right? And obviously we've inherited it for a reason, or we wanted it for a reason, because it draws those memories and it has that significance for us, right?
One of the things it makes me curious about is the portable material culture more important for the branches that left? So kind of thinking about, you all were talking about the space and the landscape as being part of the branches of the families that stayed. But when you leave, what you can take with you and those physical manifestations. So now when you talk to those extended branches of your family in Ohio and Philadelphia and all these other places, I wonder if there are connections to some of those more portable objects might come out. So I guess that's homework.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I even think about talking to my dad and my aunts having more of the objects. Like my parents don't have a bunch of my grandparents' stuff in their house, or my dad doesn't have a bunch of the stuff from his parents in the house, but I think a lot of his sisters do, and they live all over up and down the East Coast. But my dad still lives, just a few miles away from where he grew up, and he has the landscape.
Same. I think my connection is more to the surrounding landscape.
So again, if the audience wants to ask any questions, please feel free to raise your virtual hand or add them to the chat. Oh, here's one from Hillary. Hillary asks, Naya, how did the woman at Cloverfields react when you identified your family members in the collage?
Thanks, Hillary, for that question. I think she was surprised because she actually spends a great deal of time in our community, because my family's community is, like I said, less than a mile from Cloverfields. And so she looked at me and she goes, "You're related to Wilhelmina?" And I'm like, yep, that's my first cousin. Right. And she goes, oh, so you know Eloise? I'm like, that's my aunt. Like, she's married to my dad's older brother, right? So we went through this kind of like question game where she was trying to figure out where in my family tree I was located, and I was trying to figure out why she knew all these people, right? So we had this kind of like tense moment where we were kind of like doing this stare each other down game. But she has been probably one of my biggest allies in recovering my family history. So, you know, from that day forward, now that was April 2011. Was the first day that I saw this collage. And I asked her for one of the photos when I was there. And she says, well, I don't own the house. You know, I'm the one of my family who lives here, but I don't own it. I can't give you permission to take the photo. And it took me almost 7 years to get other people in her family to agree to give me the photo of my aunt. And I'm like, this is my aunt, give me the photo. It's not that hard, you know? And it took a while for me to realize that, you know, as willing as the descendant was to share information with me, she also had to navigate the relationships with her own family members and their reluctance to engage a descendant of someone their family enslaved. And so I think it actually took me working at Monticello to really understand how complex that relationship was. And to get over the kind of initial knee-jerk reaction of being like, give me my stuff, you know, like, but, you know, we've actually become pretty good friends. She comes to visit a lot. We exchange a lot of information. I was able to share new research on the enslaved community after I located the name of my second great grandmother who was there. So now we have this kind of really rich relationship out of that moment. But at first there was some shock.
Excellent, thank you. We have another question from the chat. Sally Meyer asks, do you all have any thoughts or advice when collecting family histories that are not your own family? I'm thinking of elderly community members who don't have much family or don't have family that is interested.
I think that's a great question. Also, hi, Sally. But I think that I think feeling out the situation and being sensitive towards emotion, willingness. I think a lot of people want to talk about, especially as they get older, do want to talk about the histories and the stories of their families and their communities. But I think that is completely appropriate. Like, I don't think that there is, I don't think that it veers into unethical territory necessarily. And I think that doing oral history is also about spending time and getting to know someone. So as long as you're doing relationship building and it's not just extractive, but especially, you know, you're describing it as elderly community members, and that sounds like people that are part of the larger fabric of the community. I think making people like to feel heard and like to feel listened to. And so if it's part of a relationship building, in addition, and that's happening at the same time, I think that's very, very important on multiple levels, on just a human and personal level, but also on the level of sharing the stories of our community and community memory. I tell people all the time that family history is just community history, and it is local history. And so talking to people that are part of these larger communities and that are part of it, like they're having someone interested is important. And especially, you know, if you're part of that community too, you're also inheriting that history. It's the history of your community. It becomes part of your family history in a sense as well. But the relationship building is the important part.
Absolutely. We're getting close to 7 o'clock. And so I do want to ask you all sort of one question for the whole panel is, what role do these stories, do these family histories, these oral histories, what role do they have in our lives today? Like, why should we do this? Now you look like you got a thought.
My thought was, I don't see why we wouldn't. And then I was like, maybe that's not the best answer. But yeah, I just don't, for me, my community is one that is facing significant demographic shifts. It used to be predominantly Black. It historically has always been Black. And yet the generation of families that want to stay are dying off, and they're selling their property to other people. So we're losing that continuity. So for me, I feel a sense of urgency that I don't want this special, unique character and culture of Black rural Central Virginia to be lost, because I don't see as many people in my generation and the generations behind us continuing to live in these spaces, just for lots of different reasons. So I do feel a sense of urgency in doing it.
Yeah, now what it makes me think about is the importance of us kind of fostering that place attachment. And one of the many ways we do that is in ensuring that the next generation does know the history and the oral tradition that's connected to the land, right? And whenever we don't do that, whenever we fail to hand down these stories to the next generation, right, we're weakening that tie to the point where when there are these economic threats, it's much easier for that tie to be cut, or and unfortunately we're often having to fight, right, and you're going to fight a lot harder when you know the history of what you're fighting for, what you're fighting to preserve and to protect. And I think that perseverance stems from, again, feeling that place attachment. And then I'll say too, for I guess like earlier on, I guess maybe it was right after undergrad, I was doing research around cultural socialization. And I mean, and it's evidence-based work that shows positive culturalization, particularly for Black and brown young people, is tied with higher academic outcomes and achievement, right? When you're able to draw inspiration from your family history, and even the difficult parts of the past, when you know that others before you have survived and have been resilient, that means something for you today when you face obstacles. And so there's an empowerment and a strength that has been researched and been demonstrated, that comes from having a greater sense of who you are and your family story. And so, Hannah and I this is a soapbox we all stand on, but I think for a lot of Black rural, we'll just say stick here, like Black rural Virginians, right? I feel like not enough attention and care, right, has been given to our history and culture. And the way Black rurality is presented is always this static kind of presentation where we're like running from racist, you know what I mean? It's like it's always kind of stuck in the past, and there's really no attention or care. There's some, right, but not nearly enough attention and care given to these cultural traditions and this history, so that the younger generation truly sees the value. It took me leaving home, for me to see the value of my own community, and I think I would have preferred to have known that before I left. And I think it's important, and I'm fortunate that I was able to go to a place and I had mentors who were able to instill that in me. And then my grandparents finally opened up after I started asking all the questions. But we have to do a better job of that, because it helps carry us today, right? It helps ensure that we're able to protect our home places and fight when there are threats. And yeah, I'll just stop there because I want to hear what Hannah has to say. I go.
I agree, obviously, with what Justin and I are saying wholeheartedly. And I think also because it's accurate and that history is not often taught, like our local and community histories, all of these things make up the larger histories that we learn, and they're all connected. I think that escapes a lot of people, and they're learning about history in general, that history has to do with your family, it has to do with you, and it makes it personal in that way. and understanding the connectedness that you personally have to the past, and how people that are related to you would have played a role in that, in those histories, is really important. And also it helps us better understand, like, we don't have an accurate understanding of the past without having family histories, without having, sort of, as historians would say, histories from below, but having stories of the people, of who these things are happening to. It's not the whole story for anyone. It doesn't, it's extremely important to us who grew up in these places and we know our family histories are being left out, but it's important for literally our educational systems, because it's not the whole story. And you can't understand the whole story if you don't have these pieces of local and community histories that I think that a lot of times people think of as small or like irrelevant, but like they all fit in. It's amazing when you hear hear your own family histories, or people are sharing with you, how they connect to the bigger picture of a larger history of our country, of a place, and of the narratives that are told, or butt against the narratives that are told, right? I mean, I think growing up in Central Virginia, and going to school systems in Central Virginia, having Virginia history in 4th grade, understanding and learning the African American histories of Black Virginians are things that we didn't learn, but we learned about. We did literally learn about our family members and our ancestors, but they weren't named, and they were only spoken of in passive voice, and that's ridiculous and a problem. And so I think making sure that the history is told so that it's true and it's accurate, and that people understand how history works, and how events happen, right? Also, because I think, to what Justin was saying as well, the empowerment element, finding solace and deriving strength from your ancestors. Also, if you don't understand that like regular people are the ones who are doing the change making, then you won't think about yourself as a change maker, or you won't think about yourself as empowered to change things that are different. And that's, across the board, whatever history you're talking about. So I think that's really crucial as well.
I love that. I think this idea of understanding people as change makers in the past to be able to be a change maker today is just really powerful.
And also, sorry, one more thing. Also, just the ways that like regular people who brought on change, maybe not even meaning to, just by living, and just by existing, not, I want people to live lives that bring them joy, and don't hurt other people mostly. But by doing those things, how that also shapes the landscape and the lives that their descendants are living now.
Absolutely. So we're getting close to the end of our time, but I'm gonna want to ask you all one question, but it only requires one-word answers. So we have, I've been holding this panel as part of our month-long celebration of Juneteenth. And, the origins of Juneteenth come from the celebration in Texas of the learning of emancipation. In Virginia, traditionally Emancipation Day was celebrated in April after the fall of Richmond. But now Juneteenth is a federal holiday. So in one word, what does Juneteenth mean to you? And Hannah, you're on my screen, so I'm going to make you go first.
I'm going to say more than one word, and I'm really sorry. I'm going to try to talk fast. But I hope that I think it's important to have a day of national celebration for the end of slavery and for emancipation. And I think that and I hope that it continues to prompt people to learn more about their regional and local histories and local Juneteenth, but local Emancipation Day celebrations, and to understand the importance of the local history and to learn more about that. I think that's something that can happen.
Let's bring back local Emancipation Day celebrations, because that had a good
in addition
run.
To the federal holiday.
Yeah,
you have both.
I'm curious to know why they ended also. I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of reasons, but there was a period of time, after emancipation where you would have annual Emancipation Day celebrations, like I think up through the early 20th century at least, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, this is a longer conversation, but I have theories and ideas, and also I think that migration has to play a part of that too.
Mm.
Absolutely. All right, so still gonna make you do it. One word, Justin, you're on my screen.
Oh, this is not a good word, but it's still, I'm gonna say it anyway. Cookout. That's what I want. I'm ready. We've been like, pent up. It's been a hard few months, few days, few years, right? But Central Virginia culture, Black rural culture, to me is like Southern soul music. Is Mays and Frankie Beverly. It's coming together, with the family, getting your line dancing in. But I'm really looking forward to being able to do that again with my extended family. So celebration, but in the form of cookout.
Naya, what about you?
Well, at first I was going to say freedom, but I think I'll go with justice. And that's because I think a lesser known part of the history of Juneteenth is this associated history of protest. Like even the first celebration was a corrective on people following the emancipation orders. And so I think tying it in with that 1968 revival moment with the Poor People's Campaign and the March on Washington is super important. Because I think if we're going to make this a celebration that is extending beyond the Black community, I hope we can look to our allies to bring that same energy. They need to be seeking justice, that we're working on equality and freedom, and we have never given up that part of this holiday.
I changed my answer to that. I take it back, y'all.
Well,
You need all parts.
We need it all. Right? We need to
it all.
We're fighting for justice.
History,
yes.
justice,
we have to,
celebration.
Recharge, yeah.
Yeah, history, justice, celebration, freedom, learning, national, but also local. So kind of embracing all of those components of Juneteenth. So with that, I'll give a final thank you and a plug. Thank the three of you so much for your time for this conversation. I could listen to the three of you talk for 3 more hours. And I think there's so many great ideas that have come out tonight. For those of you that are interested in continuing the conversation, and particularly with Justin's first word, cookout, next week, we're going to be focused on the taste of homecoming. So we're going to be talking about African-American food and foodways, and we'll have some really amazing experts, including Dr. Lenny Sorensen, Dr. Mia Carey, and Jerome Bias, who are all experts in African-American foodways, coming from different perspectives. And then the following week, we're going to continue the celebration a little bit more with the soundtrack of homecoming, which will feature, amongst others, Dr. Dina Jennings and Horace Scruggs, who is related to one of our panelists here. So if you
don't know which one,
the next generation of the Scruggs family. And then we'll close out the week on the first week of July, on July 6th, with the Heroes of Homecoming, talking about the military history in the African-American community and service. I would also like to invite everyone to come out if you are in the area, if you're in Central Virginia, come to Orange on Sunday, June 19th, celebrate us in downtown, see the new park. Congresswoman Abigail Spamberger is gonna be there talking. There's gonna be a libation ceremony, there's gonna be drumming, there's gonna be a live painting performance by Daryl Rose in the Art Center. There's going to be music and really amazing things. So please come join us in person. Join us online. This will be recorded and put up so you can share it with people that missed it. And any of the programs that we've already had are already online and are available for you all to watch at ocaahs.org. You can find it all there. And thanks again to everyone for spending your evening with me. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Mary.